Captain Nadia Argyris sighed softly. The small noise briefly bounced around the metallic surfaces around her before being absorbed by the still air she was floating in. A few motes of dust glittered in front of her eyes, their movement speaking more of static charges than air currents as they danced in and out of the harsh lighting in the CIC. There once was a very smart turkey. One day, the turkey decided he wanted to understand the world around him. He observed the sunrise, the rooster crow, and the farmer come and feed him. A dumb turkey would have stopped there, but our hero was indeed very smart and held his judgment. On me. The second day he again observed the sun rising, the rooster crowing, and the farmer feeding him, and again on the third, fourth, and fifth day. Finally, the turkey was satisfied. Tomorrow, he declared, authoritatively, the sun will rise, the rooster will crow, and the farmer will bring me my feed. The following morning, the farmer butchered him. The voice of Carla, the ship's artificial general intelligence, carried a courteously questioning tone, one that had evolved from delicate error messages urging users to reconsider their obviously outrageous queries. Nadija sighed softly. One of her old professors had told the story in the middle of a lesson. It was hardly the only time he'd done that. An officer should always have a modicum of perspective, she remembered him saying, before launching into this or that seemingly random anecdote. None of them had clear morals, and they never left the audience satisfied when they ended. But from time to time they would come back to her, and she would invariably spend a few minutes ruminating over one or the other. She considered elaborating on the parable further, but the idea made the corners of her mouth twitch downward, a slight ripple moving through the webbing of wrinkles on the sides of her face. She had never been talkative and became even less so as she got older. The impromptu fairy tale had already cut well into her word budget for the day, so instead, she lightly swept a hand over the flat metal surface in front of her, kicking up a whole new ballet of dust for her to watch. Out of habit, she started counting the passing seconds, eventually supplied the ship's AGI. "Thank you, Carla," said the captain. "Cut the acceleration and sound general quarters." "Certainly, ma'am." With her second sigh of the day, Captain Argyris closed her eyes and sent a twitch down her spinal cord. It felt like lifting a non-existent sixth toe on her left foot. After a millisecond, the implants she had previously deactivated came back online. Augmented reality displays appeared on every flat surface around her. In the top left corner of her vision, a bright red dot was blinking in and out, alerting her that a call to man the battle stations was going out to the ship's AR layers. On the opposite side of her entoptic screens, a list of numbers and timestamps was already flowing by. Nadija floated up from her seat, no longer weighed down by the Artemis's thrusters, watching the wall in front of her open into a high-G battle station. As she quickly undressed and slipped into her thermal suit, petals of thermally isolated carbon alloy blossomed around a central pod of metal and plastic. The whirring of cleverly hidden servos and the sliding of metal on metal were barely audible over the constant droning coming from the ventilation systems and the humming of the antimatter reactor. As she slipped into the pod, the thermal isolation slid closed over her. She felt a slight prick at her nape, and then her whole world lurched forward. She blinked once, then twice, and quickly scanned the room around her. She could again see the CIC and feel her captain's uniform brush against her skin. She was even standing as if in Earth gravity. It wasn't real, of course. A note in her AR helpfully informed her that her mind was currently residing in a simulspace construct. A virtual environment, presently running a time dilation factor of around 1.5. She got up from the sitting position she had entered the simulspace in and stood at rest, clasping her hands behind her back. Around her, the CIC had begun, populating with the ghostly holograms of her officers. Their projections blinked into existence in her same sitting position before stretching, rolling their shoulders, and taking their place in the virtual command center. Meanwhile, their owners sat far apart across the hundreds of meters and thousands of tons of the Artemis. A dozen eggs in just as many cozy little baskets. As each new ghost appeared, there was a flurry of nods and whispered welcomes. One of the engineering leads said something she barely caught, and a hint of quiet laughter flickered through the CIC, disappearing just as quickly. She didn't need access to their biofeeds to know that her officers were nervous. Almost everyone was, focused on their AR. What little conversation she could hear was whispered hurriedly and ferried across the ship's mesh to other virtual rooms where the rest of the crew was working. Softly came the AGI's voice, reverberating throughout the construct, seemingly without a source. A quick glance at the timers in her AR confirmed the statement. 58 seconds before disengaging the Mbala drive and collapsing the Alcubierre warp bubble the ship was currently traveling through. As the virtual CIC started animating, she fixed her eyes on the large holographic projection at the center of it, silently counting down the passing seconds. Just after number 58, activity in the simulated command center came to an abrupt halt as all eyes turned toward the hologram in front of her, her third sigh of the day bleeding into a whispered curse. Kurwa match. The mission tasked to the Artemis was crucial, albeit quite simple. In a stroke of luck, the human admiralty had recovered ship logs going back years detailing the movements of the Zealots' forces in what used to be human colonial space. With a massive counteroffensive in the planning, Captain Argyrus and her ship were sent, along with half a dozen other vessels, ahead of the main front. Their objective was to hit any shipyard hub or refueling station behind the contested systems, cut fire lines that would leave unsuspecting reinforcements, and retreating enemy ships stranded with dwindling fuel in a sea of emptiness. Hundreds of thousands of machine hours had been poured onto the recovered data, trying to divine patterns, and patrol routes with the singular objective of coordinating the strikes to hit their enemy at its weakest. Taking these predictions as gospel, the Artemis had then been equipped for an easy fight. They had folded expecting to face one Albion-class Zealots frigate, maybe two, supported by a docking station orbiting the system's main gas giant, but humanity's finest predictive algorithms had apparently been run on data that was, in the end, incomplete. Malicious, maybe. Or quite simply, nonsensical. A non-existent pattern found by a para-idolic intelligence, artificial or otherwise. In the large hollow dominating the center of the virtual CIC, there was no station to speak of. For starters, and no small alien frigates. What the external sensors were showing was an enormous Xin-class super dreadnought placidly orbiting a little over 1.5 light seconds away. At more than 50 kilometers from tip to tail, the enemy ship was an ostentatious display of power. Its gold-plated hull glittered in the blackness of space, a crown of massive radiators spreading like insectile wings from the filigreed ship, suffusing it in a warm red glow. The Artemis's thin and arrow-like skyscraper design barely reached the kilometer mark. Next to such an extravagant show of technological superiority, she was hopelessly outmatched. A pin in the captain's AR informed her that the simulspace construct had been cranked up to full tactical dilation. Her mind, and the minds of her crew, would now be operating 10 times faster than they would have been in baseline reality. Nonetheless, she had no time for her own musings. While in the back of her thoughts a headless turkey summarized, with a tired "I told you so," the impossibility of deriving knowledge from past data, a bubble of high-energy radiation was careening toward their enemies as fast as the fabric of space-time would carry it. For the past week, the human vessel had been hurtling through space, accelerating toward its destination while completely enclosed in its Alcubierre bubble, blind and not so slowly cooking in its own juices. As the manifold around the ship had collapsed, it had let free a cascade of gamma rays. Originally radiation collected during travel and blue-shifted waste heat, this highly energetic photon soup had quickly burst outward. In the brief time since the ship had entered the system, it had already grown to a sphere approaching 30,000 kilometers in radius. Very soon, every zealot in the system would see the universe scream in indignation at having been manhandled by the Artemis superluminal drive. The captain tightened her shoulders. "How much time do we have?" she calmly asked no one in particular. Not a lot, ma'am," haltingly supplied one of her navigation officers. "We folded in ready for a flyby. With our current orbit, we'll be crossing into their focusing distance in 3 minutes. 5 more after that, and we are in particle range." Nadija leaned forward and gripped the metal edge of the desk in front of her, hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Annoyingly, there was no bite as the construct automatically dulled the sensation. She would have welcomed some pain to help ground her as she fixed her eyes on the display. A pack of human ships could outlast a zealot capital vessel. Under constant fire, the enemy's heat sinks would fill up, and the heat would start eating through their ship, unable to irradiate out into space fast enough. Eventually, solder melted, and circuits failed. Proteins denatured and flesh cooked. But the Artemis didn't have a pack backing her up. Bearing the full brunt of the Zealots' beam weapons would leave the human vessel melted to slag before the dreadnought would so much as break a sweat. "Captain, the enemy hull just lit up and we have matching heat spikes on our ship. They are firing on us." For a couple of seconds, every eye in the CIC turned toward the sensor officer that had just spoken. "Spot size?" replied the captain, injecting as much steel in her voice as she could muster. "Well over 9 meters across." A collective sigh of relief blew over the virtual room, confusion and incredulity soon replacing the trepidation. "Cheeky fucks," she heard one of her weapons officers say. "They are taking pot shots at us. Evasive maneuvers, Captain?" No. Nadija's eyes were trained on a new screen, one showing a loop of a couple of seconds filmed from the Artemis outer hull. She could not see the laser hit, its wavelength being far into the ultraviolet, but she could see the effects on the hull. For a split second, a large oblong patch of the super-cooled armor of the Artemis had lit up with a faint glow. The shimmering on the metal then seemed to move across the bow of the ship, as the inertia of the Artemis propelled her out of the path of the incoming laser and onward toward their enemies. All in all, the hull was no worse for wear. Hitting such a large area was useless. Whatever energy had been transferred to the human vessel would be quickly re-emitted by the armor. At worst, some would have to be shuffled away to the passive radiators nestled safely in the back of the ship. Of course, as they got closer to the enemy, dreadnought the area hit would shrink down. In a few minutes, the laser would be able to focus on a spot a dozen centimeters in diameter, small enough for the concentrated energy to start melting through the super-cooled titanium surrounding the Artemis. But not all of the ship was as protected. The loop the captain was watching showed a simple radio antenna, built out of copper sheeting stretched between branches of aluminum alloys, melting as the laser passed over it. The delicate wire frame had glowed red for a split second before, folding onto itself as the flat sheets crumpled. The thin lattice and membranes of soft metals surrounding the arms of the antenna had turned into tiny red-hot droplets, hovering into space for a few brief moments before splashing over the actively cooled hull of the ship, freezing instantaneously. The captain watched the clip over and over, stone-faced. But behind the impassive facade, she felt a feral grin threatening to spill over and split her face. She had just had an idea. "How many Kasaba howitzer are we carrying?" 189, Captain, came the reply from the weapons officer after a few seconds of typing. "Load them into the missile platforms. Then, start loading every other missile we have," ordered Nadija. A chorus of "yes, ma'am" was briefly interrupted by a laser crisscrossing the hull of the Artemis a second time, its spot size just a little smaller and the patch of heat left in its wake lingering just a little longer. "Carla," she started again with a grimace, "time their cooling cycles. No point in wasting the information they're giving us. And send one of your forks to my AR. I need to run some math by you." The next 2 minutes and 38 seconds crawled by, punctuated the laser strikes from the enemy dreadnought. They came like clockwork, every 20 seconds. After each one, the surface heat reported to Captain Argyris would spike, before slowly descending as the radiators of the Artemis worked overtime to disperse it into space, each time the process taking a few moments longer. At 40 seconds from the enemy's optimal range, the surface heat hadn't had time to lower, completely before the next hit sent it spiking again. At 23, faintly glowing welts from the previous beam were still visible as the last laser crisscrossed the hull of the Artemis. At 10, the Artemis AGI started counting down their approach. Satisfied with the models Carla's fork had been showing her, the captain finally lifted her eyes from the AR screens surrounding her. Load. A 3-round spinal burst. "Adaptive targeting. Fire when ready." "Sure thing, Captain," was the cheerful reply from the weapons officer. "Coils heating up and rods cooling down. Firing in 5. Navigation. Start evasive maneuvers." "Aye, aye, ma'am." The words hung in the simulated air of the CIC, nothing seemingly changing as the seconds ticked by. Against the immobile backdrop of distant stars, it was almost impossible to tell that the orbit of the Artemis had deviated slightly, as the maneuvering thrusters had kicked in, nor that the heat emitted by the distant dot that was their enemy had just skyrocketed. "Captain, I am counting 2, 6, 9 distinct beams, matching surface heat on the enemy hull." "Damages?" reflexively asked Captain Argyris, eyeing. "The sensor readings herself? None. They fired on our old orbit. Rods are away and pinging green, Captain." Nadia nodded her head in response, her eyes drawn to the 3 green dots that had just quietly appeared on the main projection. Outside of the construct, the process had been spectacular. In the belly of the ship, 3 5-meter-long rods of enriched tungsten had been jacketed into supercooled copper sabots. In an instant, each of these coil gun rounds had been accelerated through the spinal cavity that ran the length of the Artemis. One round after the other, they had cleared the mouth of the gargantuan gun, the tungsten rods glowing a dull red and tearing through the expanding cloud that used to be the copper surrounding them. Accelerated through the coil gun, and most of all, carrying all the momentum of the week-long acceleration the Artemis had endured. Each shot could have easily crippled even an enemy the size of Super Dreadnought before them. Assuming, of course, they could reach the enemy hull through the layers of laser and particle defenses the opposing ship was swaddled in. In an ideal scenario, half a dozen other ships would fire at the same time to try and push at least 1 or 2 of the tungsten lances through the enemy's heart. But the Artemis stood alone. Nonetheless, 3 shots were as many as the captain dared to fire in a row. While the barrel of the spinal coil gun was kept void of atmosphere, the irradiated heat alone was immense. A 4th shot would likely melt the coils themselves. A 5th or 6th shot, should the gun manage to fire them, could very well kill the crew. While in the simulspace, the virtual temperature was kept perfectly comfortable, in reality the air inside the ship was already heating up. The captain watched the dots slowly glide toward the enemy for a moment, before the blaring of an alarm in the CIC had her immediately shifting her focus to the sensors officer. "9 more beams, ma'am, sweeping pattern. We have multiple hits across the bow. Whipple's shielding has been damaged in sectors 2, 4, 15, 16, and 17. No subdermal damage." "Put it on screen," ordered Nadija. She quickly focused on the hollow in front of her, where a ghostly image of her ship was slowly rotating. Thin yellow lines crisscrossed its surface, indicating the damaged armor panels, sporting bruises of warning orange where a transformer had blown or the shielding had been otherwise compromised. In the back of her head, she was already counting down from 20. "Navigation? There's only so much space we can cover in a couple of seconds, ma'am. If they can afford to just swing their lasers around like that, the best we can do is make sure they are only grazing us. And even then, with the amount of power they are pumping through those lenses." 17, 16. "Understood. Try to buy us as long as you can. Spare no Delta V," replied Nadija, her lips tightening to a thin line. 14, 13. "Engineering. Spin the reactor down to minimum. Black out everything non-essential. Brown out the rest." "Ma'am." The blaring of an alarm stopped her mental clock dead at 12 seconds. "Captain, we have dozens more beams coming at us. Damages across." She realized, barely hearing the officer's words as she watched the lasers peel the skin off of her ship. Why would the enemy give them any respite? For a dreadnought the size of the one before them, the stress of overtaxing its cooling cycle would be negligible. By the time their lenses would start to deform, the Artemis would have already been long gone. The 20-second cycle had been a simple affectation. She had barely turned toward her officer, virtual mouth open to scream an order her brain hadn't even formulated yet, when the holographic ship in front of her suddenly blared klaxon red, and the world went black. She blinked once. Around her was red. It was red, and it was burning, and it was filling her lungs. The lizard in her brain tried moving arms that wouldn't move to swim in a blinding red sea that was drowning her and boiling her alive at the same time. And when that didn't work, it tried opening a mouth that wouldn't open to scream. A scream that wouldn't come. She blinked twice. She was back in the virtual CIC, huddled on all fours, dry heaving. trying to get out of her now virtual lungs the oxygenated high-G thermoregulation fluid keeping her alive. With a shudder, she got back up, straightening herself with as much dignity she could muster. Dry hands that should have been beading with sweat swiped Adri's strand of hair that should have been dripping wet out of her eyes. The simulspace lagged behind the motion, sluggish at first and then hurried, strained. Around her, the other officers had started appearing again, some in her same position, some taking longer to let go of the panic, some not appearing at all. Status. She croaked, her brain tricking her throat into feeling sore. Heatsink a 10 overloaded, ma'am. Her sensors officer was gripping the console in front of her as if to keep herself steady. It took the rest of the A battery heat sinks with it. We have hard vacuum in bridges 1 through 4, partial hull breaches across the bow. Heat capacity is down to 65% and dropping. Rear port side thrusters were close. To the explosion site, chimed in navigation. Without them, we're mostly sitting ducks. I can put us into a very fancy spin, but we won't be avoiding anything anytime soon. The captain turned toward the hollow, looking over what was left of her ship. What wasn't scored in warning yellow or bruised in orange was flayed a screaming red. The Artemis was alive but wounded, near fatally so, bleeding atmosphere and coolant into the void as she careened toward her enemy, an enemy that the sensors were telling her was firing its laser batteries again, and yet not at them. Nadia's. Confusion lasted only a brief second until she saw one of the 3 green dots in front of her wink out. 30,000 kilometers from the human ship, the first of the 3 coilgun rounds was gone. Enjoy another story. It occurred to her. One could write dissertations on rain. On the way, it fell back home, as fat, slow dollops, or the heavy sheets of water that had tried to drown them while crossing the inner ocean, or the thin, cold, and insidious raindrops that welcomed them to Ostwald's docks, hanging in the air like a fine mist, soaking through cloth and hide and scales. The human capital looked less imposing coming from sea rather than from land, but it was still nothing short of awe-inspiring. 2 of the 3 massive concentric walls encapsulating it stopped on the A shore. The third continued as a series of lighthouses and towers. As their junk moored into port, the sights of the capital became clearer. One could see the tall spires above the buildings, topped by gargoyles screaming into the sky. Behind them, almost hidden in the distant fog, towering cathedrals called out with their deep bells. The paved walkways of the approaching docks were illuminated by ley-light street lamps, and graceful arcades arched across the upper floors of the buildings in front of them. The smells of the city wafted from the docks and lingered on her flicking tongue. There was brine and peat from the docks, as well as smoke, searing meats, and roasting chestnuts from the houses and inns. And over all others, there was the dusty ozone smell of charged laylight that left a tingling on her tongue, omnipresent in the human cities. Once the boat was moored, the merchants she had requisitioned passage from started overseeing the sailors and other low-caste workers while they unloaded the ship. She disembarked and slithered her way toward the human waiting for them at the start of the pier. It was hard to discern their hooded face in the foggy rain, but the mantle they wore was emblazoned with a crossed quill and forceps above an embattled wall with a raised gate. It was the sigil of Ostwald's University, the chief center of learning in the human hegemony. A scholar, she thought as she came to a stop in front of them. The dozens of combinations comprising the next 4 seconds had been imparted into her, memory since the hatchery, her body performing the movements as easily as her lungs breathed the humid air. The human was a scholar. The insignias of her own caste were covered by the waterproof robe draped over her shoulders, so she brought her hands to clutch her chest in the gesture of the goddess Laoshi. The left covered the right as she recited the words, "I am also a scholar. My name is..." It was spoken softly, but with firmness and as little inflection as possible. The human's rank in their caste was unknown, so she bowed her head in deference, keeping her body straight and coiling her, long tail under her. Her own rank was properly displayed by the carved rings around her neck and arms, and I am a 5th-rank chronicler, allowing her to skip the routine of gestures needed to expose it. Finally, she delivered the customary greeting between scholars in High Imperial UT. The greetings completed, she widened her arms again and raised her head, inviting her interlocutor to present themselves. The human mirrored her gestures, narrating the meanings rather than leaving them implied. Hands on the chest, the right above the left this time. I am Catherine Huber, Professor of Kinetomancy and Director of Higher Arcanist Research at Ostwald University. May he who plucks at the tapestry of the world keep your hands steady. Oh, thought Xiao, her shoulders sagging. The human in front of her was an arcanist, as indicated by the hand gestures and closing statement, which made Xiao's introduction inappropriate. That would have been embarrassing enough, but the human was the arcanist she had been sent here to meet rather than just a simple underling. Xiao's introduction had been far too casual, even bordering on offensive, considering how much higher her interlocutor's rank was. Nonetheless, the woman seemed either to have missed or decided to ignore her faux pas. After the formula was completed, she immediately raised her head and showed a full smile under lively, light blue eyes. Apologies for the human common, but my imperial UT is very limited, said Catherine, smoothly raising her outstretched arms into a shrug. Human common is perfectly acceptable, my most esteemed elder, and your knowledge of our traditions and language is very impressive, said Xiao, as she lowered her head again. Protocol dictated displaying an appropriate amount of contrition, whether the human was willing to acknowledge Xiao's mistake or not. Please, I am not going to ask you to call me Cat, but Catherine, or Professor Huber are more than sufficient. I have a carriage waiting close by. The site is a few minutes outside of the city walls, and it's freezing out here. With an exaggerated shiver, the human turned and gestured to the Yutai to follow her. The uneven cobblestones of the docks were rather uncomfortable against Xiao's soft underbelly. Nonetheless, she quickly slithered after Catherine, eager to get out of the rain. Even for a cold-blooded reptile like her, the weather was not dangerously cold, but she could already feel the slowness and drowsiness that came with a too-low body temperature. Mercifully, Catherine's carriage was indeed close, just a few unevenly paved alleys away. The carriage had obviously been built for humans, but someone had taken steps to make it more comfortable for passengers of her race. The stairs had been replaced by an extendable ramp, and half of the seating had been removed so that a Yudi's long body could fit into it. Even then, the space was cramped. While she was only a head taller than Catherine, her whole body was several meters long. Fitting her coiling tail into the carriage took some elaborate maneuvering. Once out of the rain, Xiao removed her dripping robe and checked that her precious rice paper and charcoal sticks were still undamaged, stuffed away in the waterproof pouch slung over her shoulders. Having ensured that the paper was still dry and the charcoal intact, she allowed herself to lean back in the carriage. Tail flicking about, she basked in the artificial warmth coming from above her. An arcane glyph silently hummed there, a colored glass pane mellowing the harsh blue-green tint of its active ley light. She wasn't and could never be an arcanist. A caste is assigned for life after all. But it did not take one to guess that it was probably a pyromancy glyph, nor to appreciate its reinvigorating heat in the wet and cold winter weather. Her companion climbed up opposite to her and sat down with a sigh as the carriage began moving. Catherine had lowered her hood, and the face looking back at Xiao was that of a woman approaching her middle age. A twist of platinum blonde hair kept in a top knot, more than a little ruffled from sitting under a hood in the rain, was letting a few errant strands fall over her eyes. Budding crow's feet and laugh. Lines framed a vibrant smile that easily reached her eyes. So, began the human, breaking the somewhat awkward silence. You are here to chronicle the completion of the project, correct? Yes, most esteemed, just Catherine. Catherine. The Emperor, most radiant among the enlightened, is very interested in it. Or more accurately, the governor of her province was somewhat curious. He had received a letter from the Human University inviting him to the project's presentation. As such, a chronicler was sent in his stead as quickly as possible. Her, specifically. Well, the first of many will start her maiden voyage in a week or so, just in time for all the dignitaries to show up. Until then, you can have a look around the construction site, maybe speak with Chip or Merlin. As Catherine spoke, Xiao was already writing down on her rice paper. Proper scholarly form would come later. For now, quick notes, times, and names mattered the most. Her memory had been trained, often to exhaustion, but relying on it over paper would be unconscionable. Forgetting a detail would dishonor her craft. Can you give me a short history of the project?
Sure, we have a few minutes until we arrive. We started about 3 years ago, me and Chip, with an idea. We took it from a paper, more than a century old, proposing a way to build a novel type of airship, one that relied entirely on glyphs.
And liquid laylight. No flotation devices, no enormous crystals, just ink and ingenuity. The human started leaning forward on her seat as she was talking. Her hands moved about, and the strained top knot was threatening to give out once and for all. The speech was clearly rehearsed and committed to memory, but the excitement in the voice was real, as was the sparkle in her eyes as she talked. Can you see the potential of something like this? It could be more cost-effective, hazarded Xiao. The Avian's airships were the backbone of the largest mercantile power in the continent. Reducing costs seemed like a good guess. From a certain point of view, yes. The initial investment is much higher, but the upkeep would be smaller, especially compared to the classical crystal design. Excavating intact crystals large enough to naturally lift a ship is becoming more and more expensive, but the real gain is in cargo capacity and speed. Modern airships have trouble generating enough lift to ferry a single deck of cargo. Dweor. Galleons can easily transport 3 to 4 times the tonnage at much higher speeds. But with this design, we can more than match the speed of seafaring vessels, as well as increase potential cargo capacity by upwards of 150%. She stopped writing for a moment. Head leaning forward and tongue flicking inquisitively, she looked at the human to see if she'd heard correctly. If Catherine's claims were true, this could bring a significant boost to the Avian Admiralty, and an equally significant detriment to the Dweor Kingdom, with all its numerous colonies in tow. Still, she considered that these were matters of the future, as she regained her composure and leaned back into the seat. Another chronicler will concern themselves with recording the repercussions, she thought. I must write the history of this event, its inception, evolution, sources. You said you started from a paper? Oz asked the Yudi after a moment. Ah, are you familiar with Professor Soothfeathered? He was a Corvid arcanist from the last century. He discovered a new branch of arcanism. That is correct, although it might be understating how profound an impact he has had. Catherine briefly closed her eyes. When she reopened them, there was a glimmer in them. He had a teaching position here in Ostwald when he discovered the Soothfeathered Lacroix field continuity equations. He then used them to derive the theoretical framework for kinetomancy. It was the first time someone had conducted a theoretically reductive analysis of arcanism. As a proof of concept, he described a new glyph without ever putting ink to paper. He analyzed, in detail, its functioning from nothing but math and ley-line field equations. And when built, the glyph behaved exactly as predicted. Well, minus the conversion rate between input and output error, but now we know that is a much harder problem to solve. Catherine gave a hearty laugh that slowly petered out as she raised her eyes to the bewildered snake in front of her, tongue desperately tasting the air in confusion. Sorry I get a bit carried away when... She cleared her voice, leaning back into the seat. Anyway, the point is, that crow was a genius. He launched the research into higher arcanism. Without him, we would still be using only elemental and medicinal glyphs. At the very least, we would be decades behind in anything from kinetomancy to electromancy and photomancy. The mathematical tools he developed are still considered the linchpin of modern theoretical arcanism. Catherine took a moment to untangle her unruly hair and tie it back into a knot with deftly practiced motions. Something that looked like half of a broken caliper was swiftly recovered from an internal pocket and used to secure them. A few months before he died, he published a paper. It was admittedly rough, even by the standards of the time. But it proved that glyphs abiding by certain restrictions could theoretically be scaled up indefinitely. At the time, it was mostly ignored. The applications it was proposing could be revolutionary, unassisted liquid ley-light flight included, but the technology just wasn't there to make them feasible. I was always fascinated by it, though. I butted heads with my supervisor until he caved in and let me make it the topic of my dissertation. Just the foresight of coming up with such an idea, proving it, mathematically, to be possible more than a century before it could be actually done. Catherine looked out of the carriage's window, shaking her head at the orchards and fields of the southern Molsheim barony. She smiled as the woods of maritime pines and chestnuts passed them by. Meanwhile, Zhao had her eyes glued to her scrolls, ignoring the waning rain and cooling ley-light dust above her. Her charcoal scraped against the paper in clean and practiced lines. A couple of years ago, me and Chip were having a mug of beer at the Cork. It's near the faculty, lots of colleagues go there after hours, when he mentioned a Lehrer positive, self-feeding glyph design he and his students had been working on. I jokingly asked him if he had checked its scale-up factor. The old bird starts chuckling, and then he stops dead, mug halfway to his beak. The human professor grins as she mimes the action. He was looking at me like he had just seen the first to fly hovering behind my head, flipping him off. We scampered around the inn asking for quill and parchment, charcoal and paper, a greasing brush and some soot, anything to write with and to write on. At the end of some very literal napkin math, we found a scale-up factor that was just barely negative. But I knew Cannon's holy light. I knew we could get it into the positives. Chip was skeptical, but I could feel it in my guts. 3 months later, we had it at 62, above parity, and that was the start. She sighed, and Xiao realized the carriage was slowing down. I'll spare you the low-level details, but if you want a lesson in practical glyph optimization, I'm sure Chip would be more than happy to talk your ears off. From there, it was just a matter of putting together a team, convincing the university to fund us and let us build this little compound. As the carriage came to a stop, Catherine opened the door ramp and gingerly jumped down into the muddy ground. The UD scholar snaked her head after her, turning to look up. Tongue flicking at the threatening clouds above, she wondered whether to risk exposing her precious papers to a potential sudden downpour. Deciding that a once-bitten hare is wiser, but a never-bitten one is alive, she took care to stuff them back into their pouch before slithering out of the carriage. She would just have to commit the human's next words to memory. Of course, neither me nor Chip knew the first thing on how to build a ship. Not for air, nor water, nor whatever else one can float on. That was when we brought Merlin in as well, as a half a flock of avian engineers. As the snake made her way to the human, she looked around the compound. It was a large square area sitting in the middle of a maritime forest, separated from pines and trees by a tall brick wall. Inside the wall, the ground was muddy from boots and talons walking over it. A couple of brick and wood buildings could be seen, smoke coming up from their chimneys, among a plethora of wooden tools, boards, scaffolds, and construction materials. A handful of humans were talking under the porches of the buildings or moving stuff around the compound, covered by hooded mantles. Almost all the ones noticing them gave the professor a nod or a shout, but her eyes were fixed on the sky, 100 meters above the ground. Building the airship was a mess. Ask Merlin if you want the horror stories, just be ready to. Censor his answers a bit. Not sure what your emperor's view on sailors cursing is, but that door can be a bit colorful. Slithering next to the human researcher, Xiao followed her eyes to what looked like a massive Dweir galleon, lacking masts and fitted with enormous wooden fins in place of rows of cannons, sitting in the middle of the sky. Its keel was gently, glowing blue from a myriad of interlocking glyphs covering every inch of it. The arcane symbols went from the size of a fist to big enough that Xiao could have stretched herself flat inside one and not touched the sides. Surrounding the ship were a handful of tiny avians, flying about like moths drawn to a cold flame. But, after all of that, there she is, Catherine finished, turning to her with a smile. The first of many, hopefully. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.